After my last video, I received some comments that indicated to me that maybe I could build an audience of people who would hate watch my videos. So I didn't want to neglect engaging with my newfound community. I hope I can actually articulate my perspective a little more clearly so that people stop assuming I'm a troll. This is the comment we're going to be addressing today. Toten Worlds writes, "Dude, photography isn't looking at something interesting and clicking a button. You need to learn concepts like composition, exposure, focal distance, color, balance, and more. Just because you have a platform doesn't mean you can just say whatever without actually knowing what you're talking about." This is in response to several of the comments I made in my last Pro AI video taking pot shots at photography. Now listen, I want to give photography its due. First of all, I like taking photos when I go out personally. I only take photos with my phone because carrying around a camera is very conspicuous, and because I don't want to waste time adjusting focal distance or spend hundreds of dollars on a camera or learn how to use one. But nonetheless, I still do photography. I also appreciate that photography is crucially integrated into a lot of art forms I like and respect, most notably in filmmaking. Every shot you see begins with a composition formed from photography, which is why we have a DOP, or Director of Photography, on set, working very closely with the director to create the whole aesthetic and visual language of that film. Now, having said all that, let me get to the point. Photography is a rudimentary and basic skill in visual arts. I'm not saying this to be incendiary, but I'll address why I think this is an important idea to express a little later. Despite how I mentioned photography and film earlier, I'm going to immediately make a distinction here because in a film, you are actually engineering a shot and its various components in many cases. It's the final framing of a scene that often involves specific lighting, set design, and costumes, and must take into account character positioning and movement, in addition to the camera movement moving within a scene to capture a very specific emotion while adhering to a specific, comprehensive aesthetic for that film. Photography, in the sense that we're discussing today, is essentially just looking at something, thinking, that looks interesting, and as I said in my last video, clicking a button after making this discovery. And this is the first point I want to make. Photography can be a sort of litmus test as to whether or not someone has a kind of discerning eye when it comes to aesthetics. How strong is their sense of composition and sometimes color? And this discernment will obviously play a role in how successful you might become in other fields of art, because mastery of anything requires discernment between the ideal and the less than ideal. However, photography isn't really even a form of art at all because it's not a form of self-expression. It's a form of discovery. Nothing I'm taking a photo of when I go out has come from my own mind, which is why I'm making that distinction between typical photography and photography that serves as the foundation of other artistic projects. To really get to the heart of this idea and this problem, we have to go right down to the foundational idea of what the purpose of art is. Why do we express ourselves in different mediums? Why write a song about breaking up with someone, for example, if I can just explain what happened and how I feel about it? Let's look at Edvard Munch's The Sick Child. So what I want to point out about this is how technical mastery in painting, or in the language of visual arts, is being used in the service of communicating the very specific and individual experience of traumatic loss and grief. We can imagine what it might feel like for someone to lose a sister at such a young age. And if we tell someone this verbally, we're communicating something for which the listener's empathic mind is conjuring up what that experience might feel like. But as a listener, I have no way of understanding this grief without knowing Edvard Munch's sister and knowing how Munch thinks and processes grief and memories, and what the everyday experience of having a sister become increasingly sick is like, or how she, as an individual, handled that. The only way for me to truly understand what that grief really was is to have lived my whole life as Edvard up to that point. The painting is also an incomplete representation of that experience, but it fills in more experiential information that a plain description could not. It isn't the true representation of what the artist is trying to convey, but it's a more accurate approximation than plain description can accomplish. It's a higher fidelity transmission of the genuine experience. If Munch chose to represent this experience as 3 red squares on a white canvas, no one viewing it would even be able to interpret what the communication attempt was without external clarification. Meaning this would be a failure in the use of the artistic medium, because art is extra-verbal communication. Except when it isn't, because, well, I can't really introduce this concept of nonverbal language in art without also acknowledging that the development of this language across mediums is also an art form, often wholly isolated from representational expression. In other words, there are mediums that also operate purely within the aesthetic framework, like fashion and architecture. Representational artists can develop their own aesthetic as well, but my point is that art can't only be limited to the idea of self-expression, because the aesthetic language of that representation needs to emerge from somewhere, and some art forms are dedicated to that pure abstraction of beauty. Now, I know that there are people who will hear the word aesthetic and see an in to include photography here, but again, the photographer isn't really engineering any of that aesthetic. They're relying on interior design, fashion, and architecture, and then putting these elements within a specific flat rectangle art. If that's art, then the curator at an art gallery is also engaging in a form of art by way of simply curating. So is collecting now also a form of artistic self-expression? And this is the point. The reason we produce art at all, instead of just explaining plainly what we want to express, is because there are some things we can't simply explain. Words fail to capture what exactly we're trying to express, and so the process of making art can be the process of discovering a language beyond a simple explanation with which we can express more accurately what it is that can't be expressed simply in words. And this is the second idea, which is important to understand and which is often not understood at all. It's not just that you have something inside that you want to express. That's not art on its own. Art is a form of communication, which means it's not just that you're trying to express something that words can't perfectly articulate. It's that you have mastered this nonverbal language to the extent that other people can also understand you. And that language is whichever medium you're working in. And by nonverbal, I don't mean that no language at all is involved, but there's more to a song than lyrics, and more to a film than the screenplay. And even a screenplay and lyrics and poetry express ideas through things like implication or story or poetic device, rather than raw, explicit description. So whoever says this artwork means whatever you, the audience, thinks it means, has failed as an artist because they've failed to actually communicate anything, and are now relying on the tendency people have toward random pattern seeking to endow their work with meaning. And this is the first problem with photography as an art form. When we look at the most prestigious photographers and the ones who hang their photographs in art galleries and so on, they often have that mentality and style of communication. It's not that they're communicating anything specific that the audience can often pick up on. It's just that people are in the environment and culture which tells them there must be some deep meaning to this photography because it looks like it was taken with an expensive camera, and here it is hanging in a gallery. That's actually the definition of pretentious. You're endowing all of this excess meaning into something because your mind is seeking out that deep meaning when you look at it. You have been primed to believe it must exist when it really doesn't. Or in instances where the photographer did catch something meaningful, and that meaning is fairly obvious, and maybe it does speak to something more deeply interesting or provocative or revelatory in some other way, in all those cases, you're just looking at the phenomenon of being in the right place at the right time, and being opportunistic about when you take a photo. You're not engineering anything from scratch. It isn't about color or composition or anything like that. It's just about discerning the right moment to take a photo, and sometimes doing that under dangerous conditions. And this takes me to the main issue I mean to talk about regarding the pedestal we've put photography on in the modern era. Look, I'm really not trying to insult anyone who likes doing photography. I do too. The issue is that we've lost all sense of calibration because we don't, as a culture, really think art is important anymore, even though lots of people like to pay lip service to it. Let's take a short detour for a moment and talk about boxing. Everyone understands that if you look at a boxing trainer, an instructor who was once a professional boxer and is now 70 years old, and start insulting them and challenging them because they're old and because they're now no longer even as competent as young amateurs, everyone would correctly view you as a punk who had no respect for boxing and didn't have the appropriate respect for this person's legacy. But let's take that to the other extreme, and let's imagine that this polite sentiment were culturally enforced in a way that it became half-heartedly believed and endorsed as a truism in some or all gyms. It may seem nice to do that, and you could even express ideas that kind of sounded true. You might say that an older boxer has a lot of experience to draw from, for example. But if we started really endorsing this idea that age didn't matter in boxing or in fighting, we'd likely start introducing a lot of unwanted side effects from embracing that delusion. For example, you might have boxing gyms that promoted a 10 or 20-year program to develop basic competency in fighting because you'd lose the recognition that there's an age window where you're going to be the most effective as a fighter. You might also start phasing out sparring because if your belief doesn't match reality, then it becomes more ideologically dangerous to introduce situations that will threaten that belief and the identity built on top of it. And when you introduce side effects like this, the whole art form starts eroding and dying as a result. People lose track of what mastery means, and then they replace this concept with anything that will serve as an excuse for low competency. You might then say that boxing is not about fighting, but about self-mastery. You'll build up a whole language of propaganda that sounds reasonable, but hides the decay of the underlying art form. And the result of that is that generation after generation, that art form becomes less relevant. People may nod and agree with the propaganda, but it's not going to convince them to care about the art itself. Not forever. But fighting is different than art in general. You may have a specific and unambiguous goal in mind. You may want to be better able to survive a violent encounter. Or maybe you'll want to compete, in which case the outcome of fighting competitively is always going to be binary in a way that art generally is not. People don't like to talk about levels of mastery in art, and for some good reasons. They'll say, everyone has different tastes. It doesn't matter if an artwork is popular or influential as long as you like it. Art is subjective. And there's some truth to all of those ideas, but it's also true that if you go to a restaurant that serves you chicken topped with pickles and drizzled with chocolate sauce that has some hair in it, you're going to be far less likely to whip out the art is subjective and we can't say this food is bad argument when you have the plate of food in front of you. So why is it that people are so judgmental with food, but not with, for example, paintings or poetry? Well, it's because they care about food and they largely don't care about painting and poetry. These art forms don't really need to serve a purpose anymore, so they can be whatever you want. When people lose their appetite for an art form, they will be more lenient with the output they see. This is not a good thing. It's what happens to mediums in decline. I think appetite is a good word to use in describing this problem. If you don't like the taste of fish, but you love lasagna, you're going to be far more discerning in what constitutes a great lasagna. You might even have criteria for it. Whereas if your friend, who's a chef, shows you how they've prepared fish, you're going to look at it and basically say, good for you. I'm glad you're cooking something you like. Because their cooking has nothing to do with your appetite. So you may say that art is subjective and everyone has different tastes, and that's true up to a point. One person may like salads and curries, another person may especially like steaks. So there's variance in what people have an appetite for. But if you have that appetite, you're going to be discerning about what constitutes a great curry, for example. You're not going to think any slop you throw into this curry is equally good because there's no objective standard and anything can be food. And the fact that you can train as a chef or as an animator or a game developer or anything else is a testament to the fact that there is a difference between an amateurish effort in an artistic field and mastery. But that distinction slowly starts eroding when an art form loses relevance and stops attracting and validating a framework for competence. And this is the biggest problem we have when we put photography on the pedestal we currently put it on. It doesn't matter if Hayao Miyazaki himself personally tutored you for a month on how to be a great animator. You're not going to be able to reach his level of mastery within a week, a month, a year, probably not in your whole lifetime if you dedicated it exclusively to that craft. Because the concept of mastery has not been decimated in animation to the extent it has been in other artistic fields. No one listens to rock music played by people who don't even understand the basics of how to use their instruments. But this way of thinking is normalized in the high arts. That's not because people love painting and poetry and sculpture more, it's because they love it less. It's because those art forms have died, surrounded by people joyfully proclaiming that the corpses of those mediums are healthy. The same problem exists in photography. The simple evidence that it's a rudimentary skill is that you could hand any competent director or painter a camera, and they're going to be able to take beautiful photographs, even if they've never taken photographs before. Hand the photographer a video camera or a paintbrush, and they're not going to suddenly become Akira Kurosawa or Rembrandt. There's no concept of mastery in photography. It's an illusion. So if there's no skill ceiling in photography for feats that can't be accomplished without 10 years or 20 years or a lifetime of training in that craft, then people should stop putting it in the same realm of mediums where these levels of mastery exist. What I'm talking about in general in this video is the push to flatten the concept of competence in the arts. It's not even really about photography specifically. It's all the same propagandized mentality, and the undue elevation of photography as being on par with other art forms is just one tendril of this larger, pervasive problem. The people who marvel at it don't have the introductory skill needed to enter into other forms of visual art. It's the introductory skill of having a discerning eye. Just like you need to know what a good steak tastes like if you want to become a competent chef who cooks steaks. Now, just like the person who says the professional boxer who's now 70 would not be able to compete, it's difficult for this critique not to come across as mean-spirited trolling. But the point is that if the industry and public perception of that industry or medium is so infected with this corrosive ideology that's destroying it from within, someone has to say what other people are evidently not really willing to say. The art world in general needs to purge postmodernism as the infectious disease it is and start reconstituting the ideas of competence, actual self-expression, and mastery of the language of that self-expression. Whichever medium fails to do this is going to die or is already a walking corpse.